Hello, you lovely listeners. I'm Amy. Welcome to the Really Good Conversations podcast, where we will delve into the minds of the business people we have met in the process of launching our first card game. We will be uncovering their secrets to success, their biggest mistakes, and sharing the key lessons they have picked up en route. So, if you're looking for an engaging chinwag mixed with business insights and a good pinch of fun, you're in the right place. Let's have a really good conversation. Welcome to the Really Good Conversations podcast. Today we are joined by Dr. Delia McCabe, who is a cognitive resilience consultant, neuroscientist, keynote speaker, and author. Delia has a fascinating background in clinical psychology, and she specializes in how lifestyle choices and nutrition affects our brain function. She helps individuals and organizations optimize brain health globally. Welcome to the podcast, Delia.
Thank you for inviting me, Amy. I'm really delighted to be here.
Thank you so much for joining me today. And I'm going to kick off with a question to ask you about obviously food and brain health, which is obviously something you are an expert in. And I'd want you to give me a bit of a tip that if I've got a big presentation coming up, whether it's a pitch or I'm working with a new client, what would be the best sort of food I should have for my brain health?
This is a big question because you actually need to be preparing beforehand, not just the meal before the presentation. But the one thing that I can say for sure is you want to have stable blood glucose because, there's nowhere to store energy in the brain. So we really need to make sure that our blood glucose is stable so that we've got stable cognition and also stable mood. So that's the first thing. So you would have a meal that had the capacity to provide stable blood glucose. And that would have to be, good carbohydrates, not crisps and a lolly, for example. You'd want to have either high fiber carbohydrates, good veggies, and good fats, things like avocados, things like maybe crushed chia seeds and flax seeds. And you'd also want to make sure that you were well hydrated because a large percentage of brain volume is actually made up of water, and there's a large percentage made up of fat. So we want to keep that into account, take that into account. And then the other thing, of course, is coffee. Coffee can really make us hyped up. And when we do a presentation, it's so much better to be calm and relaxed, but thinking clearly versus hyped up with caffeine, which actually stimulates adrenaline synthesis. So those are a few things to keep in mind. And then, of course, good sleep. Because if we don't sleep well, it's really hard to feel calm and relaxed. And we naturally gravitate to highly processed food when we don't sleep well to give us extra calories and extra energy because we actually lacking in that neural energy when we don't sleep well. So a few things to keep in mind.
Oh, that's brilliant. I can definitely resonate with a few of those things you've highlighted there. And I do notice if I've had a coffee and then I have a meeting or a call with someone, I almost can feel that I've really been the chatterbox side really comes out.
Yes, because of that adrenaline. And so it will make you not really maybe think as clearly. Because the thing about coffee is we need to let coffee serve us versus the other way around. So coffee can really stimulate focus and concentration, but it doesn't stimulate creativity and innovation from a cognitive perspective. We need a different set of neural circumstances for that. So if you find that you get really chatty with the caffeine, then that's just because the adrenaline is making you hyper-focused and really concentrating on what you're busy doing.
Oh, brilliant. That's good to know. We obviously caught up earlier, and the topic that we're going to discuss today with you is how conversations impact the brain. How you see the conversations people are having in their day-to-day life, whether that's work or personal, how that is actually impacting us.
I think that conversations are one of the most important things that we need to pay attention to, especially in today's world. And that's why I really am so excited about the work that you and Alex do, because in all honesty, we're not having enough conversations today, Amy. People are really immersed in technology and they mistake a like or a brief comment on social media platforms as an interaction. Now, when we have a conversation with a person, either the conversation we're having now or a conversation in person, We're exchanging ideas and we're exchanging concepts and we're seeing something from the other person's perspective. And then we should be allowing ourselves to contemplate that perspective and thoughtfully respond to what that person has just said. Now, unfortunately, the technology immersion that most of us are involved in prohibits that. And we have a very fast response to what the other person has said. And unfortunately, the younger brains that are growing up in this environment are not learning that conversation is something that is a two-way street. Because if they don't like an idea, they just shout it down or cancel a person. They don't respond in an open-minded way where they consider what the other person has said and why the other person has said that and asking questions related to that. So that is really dangerous from a brain development perspective, because then this becomes the habit. You default to that habit when you don't like what somebody has said or you don't understand it and you don't want to admit that you don't understand it or that you're not knowledgeable about that topic. The other thing is that it stops us from contemplating other solutions to problems. And then, of course, with adults, this is becoming more and more prevalent, because if you don't like what somebody says, you just ignore them and carry on doing what you do and then find your tribe that agrees with you. And it doesn't mean that because your tribe agrees with you, you're coming up with the correct solutions to the challenges we're facing. And the more challenges we face, we actually need to be more open-minded and getting more people's ideas. So be more open to conversation. So I think the work that you do is critically important, not just for adults, to teach us again to have an open mind, but very important for families to engage in these conversations so children learn it's fine to disagree and what does that disagreement teach us and where we can go from there. So conversations are very important for our species, because that's how our brains developed, in conversation with other people, considering the challenges that we face and solutions to those.
Wow, that is very insightful. Why do you think some people feel that they perhaps struggle a conversation than others? You might hear people that go, oh, I'm no good at starting conversations, or oh, I always get a bit awkward in conversations. Do you know any thoughts on why that might happen for some people?
I think it's lack of practice. If we don't have lots of conversations with people, then we forget how to have those conversations. And I think that's what happened to a lot of people, during the different lockdowns. It's one of the challenges that human beings have. If they don't practice something, they lose the skill. And if you haven't practiced it, you don't know how to start a conversation, which is why the work that you're doing is so critical. Because if people are lacking in that skill, once they start engaging with your cards, they then build up that skill. So I think firstly, people need to want to improve their conversational skills, and then they just need to practice them with everybody. But there is something else that I want to mention, which very few people really think about, and maybe it's just because of my age. You know, I grew up in a time where if you were waiting for a bus or you were waiting for an event, you didn't have your phone to look at. So if there was somebody there, you ended up just chatting to them because they happened to be there, and human beings don't really like to be with each other and not converse if they don't have smartphones. Yeah. So you learned to speak to people that were complete strangers, and you dealt with that feeling of uncomfortableness, because it's normal when you address somebody that you don't know at all, that you feel slightly uncomfortable. So you'll have a little bit of stress hormone synthesis. And we got over that, and we survived, and it was actually fine. And so we built up this skill set that allowed us to speak to complete strangers. Now, if you go around in the world today, and, recently we went back to Australia and then, came back to America, and I was on the lookout continuously through all the airports that we went through, watching people. And, 95% of people were engaged on their phone. So they were not engaging with the people around them. And guess what? I saw it continuously, that they felt uncomfortable doing that. And they would only do that if they were pushed to do that, and they didn't have their phones. So that's something else that's really important, and we should keep in mind. We've lost the capacity to speak to strangers, and we need to bring that back. And I'm not sure how we're going to do that.
Yeah. And we all find ourselves doing it, like you said, standing in a queue for something, you'll just reach for the phone and sometimes not even realize you're sort of doing it. Perhaps rather than speaking to the people around you, as well to, pass the time. And I know over the years, Alex, many a time he'll be, sending me forward to go, oh, you go ask the person that, you go ask them. And I'm like, well, you go, it's no problem. They're only human or something. And I think for some people, obviously, there's that slight more anxiousness or barrier of not making a fool of themselves or perhaps feeling, oh, well, I'll get, rejection perhaps that can make them hold back. And what do you think for people, we were talking before, you and I, in certain situations when it comes to habits and such, taking a step back perhaps and taking a pause, before you go on to do something. But why do you think some people interrupt a lot in conversation?
This is a good question. And I think, once again, it's a habit that they've come to embrace because it obviously has served them, speaking over other people. But also it can be linked to anxiety. So when people feel very anxious, then they will interrupt other people. But there's a deeper challenge here because it means that person hasn't practiced listening to somebody else. Because if you are truly listening to somebody else, you're not thinking about the next thing you're going to say. You're thinking about what they're saying. And then you'll take a pause and then you'll respond. So once again, it's practice. And I find myself dealing with people that interrupt in a way that highlights to them that they've interrupted. So I generally allow them to do it. I wasn't expecting to explain this, but I will, Amy. I generally allow them to interrupt twice.
Please.
And then I say to them, as I was saying, before you mentioned X, to show that I have listened to what they have said, I'll say, this is what I wanted to complete. And when I say it that way, generally it brings to consciousness that they have interrupted me. And sometimes they'll apologize and say, sorry, I didn't mean to. And then it just means that it's top of mind for them. That with me, they're not going to be able to interrupt. But I think that when somebody does that, we just need to teach them nicely and kindly that what they've done has actually interrupted the flow of the conversation. And it just takes a few times to do that with a person to actually alert them to the fact, even if they know that only with you they can't interrupt. So it's just a matter of practice. But I think also to keep in mind that often these people are anxious. And, to step back, speak more slowly, and just to be physically relaxed so that they can mimic that. And this is an unconscious process that you can get them to actually sense about yourself. That will allow them to calm down and to feel less stressed, and then allow them to hopefully let you finish what you're busy trying to share.
That's a really good tip there that you've provided as well, because I think we've probably all been in those situations, and you sometimes feel that the other person perhaps just isn't self-aware, and either they're changing the topic of conversation constantly or interrupting you, and you sort of walk away thinking, I don't know if they listened to a word I said. I know I felt that situation as well. And sometimes you're trying to say, or just finish the story as well. And something I've noticed actually in group situations I've been in, particularly at dinner tables, once a group is maybe, over 4 people, and I find we can end up in split conversations. And in some instances, I've actually said, can we just finish this conversation? And then that one, it typically happens with family members. I'm not going to obviously name names. But where I'm finding we're all having this cross conversation over the table, rather than let's all be part of one conversation. Yes. And I guess what's that doing to the brain? Do you think, this jumping around between split conversations?
It's a good question, Amy, because what happens is the brain is actually incapable of listening to 2 different conversations optimally. So it'll be picking up some things from one conversation and picking some things up from another conversation, but really battling because it's trying to multitask, which is impossible. So what it ends up doing is shifting task. So it'll listen a bit to this and it'll listen a bit to that, and then it'll just not be able to respond optimally. So I like what you're saying there, because I think it's important, because once again, this is a learned skill. for people to say, okay, hold on a second. We're all having these conversations. Let's just consolidate the conversation and share it, because we actually all have a better time when we give each other a turn. And sometimes you just need to alert people to that and, just create a new habit around how we converse. Because as I said, if we haven't had practice in this, we've lost the skills because of lockdown and because of online communication. And many people's anxiety levels are really high today. So we've got those three variables acting in concert. We may just need to step back and say, hold on a second, as you've said, let's, consolidate this conversation. The brain definitely enjoys that a lot more, because then it can actually focus on that one topic and, get engaged in it and dive deeper. But it's harder with some people than others, I must say, because some people just want to do things their way. And, we learn. We don't enjoy conversations with those people. And eventually they become quite isolated because they do this to everybody. And nobody likes to just be spoken at.
Yes. I think typically it does happen as well when you're perhaps going out as couples, and it's almost naturally perhaps the ladies will end up talking and the men will end up talking, but you're sort of wanting to kind of have a catch up all together, really. Or you go home. I know sometimes Alex and I'll go home from dinner and you're a bit like, oh, so what was so-and-so saying? Yes. And then so even though you were all together at the same dinner table, you've just been in this kind of separate evening almost of conversations because of this splitting conversations. It's good to understand as well how that plays out. So we've actually touched on a couple of tips as you've been speaking then, but if you were to summarize any, I guess, top tips for people when they are having conversations, whether it's in the workplace or personal, what would be some tips you might give people to when it comes to the brain and conversation?
I think one of the things that I generally share with people is not to have a conversation when we're feeling very emotional, because emotion travels much faster in the brain than thought. And if we get really uptight and we're distressed about something, what comes out of our mouth is not what would have come out if we had sat back and thought carefully about it. In other words, cognitively analyzed our response versus an emotional knee-jerk reaction. So I often say to people, if you're in a situation and you feel highly emotional about whatever is being discussed, physically remove yourself. You can take a step back physically, which sends a message to your brain that you're disengaging. And you can say, please excuse me for a moment. I just need to grab a glass of water or a cup of tea or some coffee or go to the bathroom. In that space, you're giving your brain time to allow it to deal with that emotion. And then cognition will step in and help you. And then when you go back, you have a much more thoughtful response. The challenge we have today is that a lot of our interaction happens online. And when you don't give yourself the reprieve, the actual physical space and the cognitive space to step back from that response that you may want to, send via your fingers, you can end up causing a lot of damage because you're sending a response that isn't thoughtful. It isn't using cognition. It's using emotion. You will find that your interactions will improve significantly if you just keep that one tip in mind.
That's brilliant. And something actually I'll touch on, because you mentioned emotions there. And when we think of the brain, I've heard the concept perhaps that there's a second brain in your stomach almost. And, often we say the stomach and gut is just play a part in emotions. But obviously a lot of the work that you do is in nutrition. So what's your thoughts about that in terms of, again, what you're eating is ultimately playing a role in your, obviously, gut and then also in your brain as well?
An important question, Amy, and there are basically two parts to answering this. And it is a complex discussion, so I'll make it really simple. The first part is that, the gut has to digest the nutrients that we provide it with, and it does so in the presence of specific bacteria. And to do so efficiently, the food needs to be the right kind of food, and we need to have the right kind of bacteria. And then it crosses over into the blood via the gut lining and finds its way to all our cells, including our brain, which it has to cross the blood-brain barrier to do. If we don't eat the right kinds of foods and we don't have the right kinds of bacteria which work together, what happens is that the gut becomes less capable of stopping compounds that the immune system picks up in the bloodstream and then alerts the body to an inflammatory response, or stimulates an inflammatory response. And so then what happens, that the blood-brain barrier becomes damaged in this process of inflammation. And then what happens, we have inflammatory compounds that cross into the brain. And this is how we now know that the gut impacts the brain. And we have now linked gut dysregulation with things like depression and anxiety. So that's the one thing to keep in mind, the actual nutrients and inflammatory compounds that get introduced from an inadequate breakdown of those nutrients that then enter the bloodstream. So that's one thing to keep in mind. And I've simplified that enormously. I've got a good blog article that explains it in more detail, so any of your listeners can go and read that. The other thing to keep in mind is something called the vagus nerve. And the vagus nerve, the name is wonderful because vagus is Latin for wandering. And this is a very important nerve that wanders down from the brain all the way around all of our organs, including our gut. And it sends information up to the brain. Interestingly, 80% of the communication is from the vagus nerve to the brain, and only 20% is back down. So we know that the vagus nerve picks up all sorts of information about what's going on in the gut, the heart, the lungs, the liver, all of that, and sends information up to the brain. So with that process, we know that the brain is learning about what goes on in the gut and whether things are running smoothly there. You know, for example, if we feel stressed and anxious, we know that our gut can give us a problem. We know that we get butterflies in our stomach. And as my daughter once said, Mom, it feels like bats in my stomach when she got really stressed. So we know that this interaction between the gut and the brain is a very strong and robust interaction. So we don't know all the details about how this works. But when we speak about the gut being the second brain, we know that it's very important in terms of brain function. And not just because about 80% of our serotonin is synthesized in our gut. It's because of the nutrients and the communication via the vagus nerve.
Wow, that is fascinating. And I know we said, we'll focus on the topic of conversation. But just as that came up, I thought, actually, yes, I'm going to ask this because, it is opening Pandora's box with some of the conversations that we could have in the work that you do. Now, thank you so much for sharing those insights from your world. Now, obviously, what I love to do with all of our guests is play some cards from one of our pack of cards, one of our packs. And today I have picked out 3 questions from the Kids 2 pack. So we actually launched a second version of the Kids pack in, I think it was November time, just really to give more fabulous conversations for families and kids aged 6 to 12. But really, they work for all of us, they're still interesting and insightful questions. So question number 1, if you had to change your surname to the last thing you ate, what would your new name be?
Blackberry.
So Dr. Delia Blackberry.
Yes.
That's got quite a ring to it.
Yeah, it does actually. And the reason it's blackberries is because there are some beautiful organic blackberries that I picked up, earlier in the week. And I thought they're fantastic. So I had them with my breakfast. And the last thing I put in my mouth with my breakfast was my blackberries. So yeah, blackberry.
Fantastic. Well, if you need a second stage name, Delia Blackberry can now be it. Brilliant. Question number 2. If you could have a secret magic door in your room, where would it go?
Wow, this is a big question. And I can see that it would really ignite the imagination of children. I think at this point in my life, the secret magic door would be able to take me to Australia very quickly instead of the 30 hours. And I could go and visit my family there. That would be my secret door for now.
Brilliant. I would also like a door that helped with that sort of tele-transportation around the world rather than the flights and things. So yes, if anyone is working on that yet, that would be excellent. Question number 3. If you didn't have electricity anymore, what would you miss the most?
Oh, that's a big question, because we couldn't have this conversation, and I'm really enjoying this conversation. So that would be hard. And I think also in the peak of summer here in Austin, it would be hard not to have an air conditioner. So I think I'd probably say air conditioner and, the capacity to communicate across the miles like we are now. Amy, I don't think I could actually eat quite well without an oven or a stove, because I eat a lot of raw food already. I think I'd miss some of my really yummy pastas, and that would be a bit of a challenge. But I could probably get by on raw food.
You could just make a fire. You could make a fire and boil water on the fire.
There we go, I could. But not when it was peaking with heat outside or freezing cold. Or probably when it was freezing cold, it would be easier to make a fire. So yes, I could probably manage that. But I've never made pasta over a fire. So that would be a new challenge.
Oh, brilliant. Well, they were all great answers. And I'll ask you the final question that I'll ask all of our guests as well, which is, if you could ask any person, dead or alive, a question, who would it be and what would you ask them?
Since I saw that question when you sent it to me, I have been pondering who this person would be. And it's been very hard for me to find that person. I think probably because the question I would like to ask a person who has succeeded and done so despite huge challenges, I think the question would be, how did you get through the tough times? And, there are people like Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo and Beethoven and Mozart, people that have really left their mark in the world. I think that's what I'd like to ask any of those people who were very, very gifted, but who obviously had a lot of challenges. I'd just like to say to them, how did you get through the tough times? Because I think we've got a lot of challenges ahead of us as a species. And, people that are trying to make a difference in the world, like you and like me, sometimes we think to ourselves, and I'm not, trying to compare myself to those great people, but I think if you're trying to make a difference in the world, you do come up with challenges. And so I'd just like to say to them, what do you have a bit of advice about how to get through those tough times?
Yeah, that is brilliant. And it's crazy because I think we've touched on it on this call, where they were in their time and the other, shall we say, external environmental factors and distractions. We know with technology and such, it is fabulous, it's fantastic, but at times, a blessing and a curse, where I wonder in their worlds where, there wasn't perhaps the global connectivity and just different ways, I guess, of doing things. I guess they were able to make a mark because they perhaps weren't getting distracted of what was happening over there or here, or like you were talking earlier, and, they weren't looking at phones to get gratification from a like or a comment online. Perhaps there was more of that self-belief as well.
I think that is a very, very important point, Amy. And I think it brings us right back around to conversation, because I think that the distractions that we are experiencing today, just a statistic for the listeners to keep in mind, that once we have been distracted from a task we're busy with, it takes about nearly 24 minutes to get back on task cognitively. Mm-hmm. So if you consider that people are being distracted regularly throughout the day, either from external, notifications, and, beeps and blips and emails, or otherwise internally by picking up their phone themselves, whatever they are being distracted by and however it's happening, it may take them, as I said, nearly 24 minutes to get back on task. Now, if you are trying to accomplish a big goal, it is so much harder to get that done. Your productivity is really, really low because of this external distraction continuously. And as we discussed, before we started recording, that neural energy, we need neural energy to be able to keep us on task with focus and concentration, and also to inhibit the impetus to distract ourselves. So we end up becoming exhausted as the day goes on. And so I find a lot of people are burnt out. And I think of this as a modern kind of burnout because of this ongoing onslaught of our engagement with technology. So that's a very important point. And once we bring real conversations into our lives again, it'll be easier for us to say we get so much more enjoyment from real interaction versus kind of a shallow interaction online.
Well, that is a great place to sort of conclude our conversation today. So thank you so much, Delia, for your time. How can people find out more about you? You've got some fantastic resources. You've got some brilliant books, and also you've got some courses. So where can people find out some more information?
Amy, they can find me on LinkedIn, where I'm quite active, and I've given you the link for that so they can find me there. They can also find me on my website, which is a little bit neglected. I've got a new blog about making habits sticky, which they may find useful when they start creating, behavior change. I've also got some courses on Teachable. So there are a few places that people can find out about me. And I'm always happy to engage, and I'm always happy to answer questions. So any of those places would be fine with me.
Wonderful. Well, I'll include all of the links in the show notes, and also a thank you because you have provided a 20% discount code as well for our listeners. So I'll include that as well. And thank you so much for your time and for your conversation today.
Thank you, Amy. It was a delight to chat to you.
Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed the episode. Be sure to check out the show notes for more information on today's guests. And if really good conversations are your thing, hit subscribe and join us next time for more business journeys, insights and banter.